Australia is not an independent country, and I'll prove it to you. 39 years ago, the Australian and British Parliaments passed the Australia Act 1986. This also terminated the right of Australians to appeal to the Privy Council if a High Court of Australia decision didn't rule in their favour. So it's actually been questioned on whether or not this was actually a legal legislation, because it's literally violating the Constitution. I'll show you. Whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established. And then it goes on to say, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, and with the advice and consent of the Lords, spiritual and temporal and commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. It's basically saying that the Australian Parliament has permission to federate by the British Parliament. In the Australian Parliament, it literally says, an act to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia. The Australian Parliament did not create itself. It was granted permission to exist by the British Parliament. Moreover, the Australia Act 1986 was enacted by the Parliament of Australia, which is not a recognised legislator under Section 1 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900. The Royal Styles and Titles Act of 1953 changed the Queen's name from the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland to the Queen of the British Commonwealth and her realms and territories. This was passed by the Australian Parliament. There was another one passed in 1973 that gives the Queen her title of the Queen of Australia. This was passed by the Australian Parliament. This creates a crisis. For one, this is actually amending the Constitution without a referendum. So that's violating section 121 of the Australian Constitution by changing her name and changing the powers. So this is how it was done. The Prime Minister and the Premiers of the states reached an agreement at conferences held in 1982 and 1984 to introduce legislation in each of the parliaments for a uniform change in each state, and the British Parliament passed individual acts before the Commonwealth enacted its own Australia Act. So it says that it's being enacted by the Queen. So this is actually violating the Section 1 of the Australian Constitution, which we spoke about earlier, that the Australian Parliament is not a legitimate head power over Australia. The Queen is. But how can the Queen be that when her title is the Queen of Australia? Creates a bit of problems there. So the British Parliament can actually overturn the Australia Act and the Australia Constitution Act because they are acts of British legislation. To insinuate that they can't because they had an agreement with Australia, who ordains their right to govern from their acts of legislation, is implying that the British cannot overturn their own laws. That is one of the most basic legal principles. So anyone defending that is just not listening to reason. Sure, in an event where those acts are actually overturned, Australia can appeal to international courts, but they would actually have to deny the British their sovereignty over their own laws to uphold Australia as an illegal entity. So as it stands, we still have our right to govern because of the British Parliament, not because we've had a war with the British. Unlike the Americans, they actually actualized their own independence through a declaration and through winning a war. They're not bound to any legal jargon, whereas we are. Same thing goes for Canada and New Zealand.